Please welcome to the stage our keynote speaker, Alex Stamos.
Thanks for coming out today. Thanks to Microsoft for inviting me back to BlueHat. I actually got to be at the first BlueHat, which was much smaller. It was on the Microsoft campus, and it included a number of bizarre moments, including me getting stuck on that floating bridge with a bunch of Microsoft executives and security researchers in a limo full of hard alcohol. We won't be talking about what ended up happening while we were stuck for 6 hours because it rains in Seattle and nobody expected that, apparently, when designing your transportation infrastructure. Instead of talking about that, what we're going to talk a little bit about is we're going to talk about where we're going in security and some of the basic issues we have as an industry of applying our efforts to actually keep people safe. And the things we need to be thinking about if we want to focus ourselves on the real problems that are facing people. And we got to talk about this because it just turns out that as an industry, we're not doing so hot, right? And by we, I mean like a pretty large set of people, of the tech companies themselves, the engineers that work there, the people kind of in the academic CS space, and the nerd culture in general. We have been incredibly effective in inserting technology into every aspect of people's lives, of making them completely dependent on the technology, and then effectively leaving them on their own to deal with the aftermath. And that has not gone unnoticed. You might recognize a fun little show called Silicon Valley. Being in Seattle, you guys get to keep pretty much out of the jokes that are made about the Valley. I guess if it was set here, there'd be more Patagonia puffy jackets and such. But I do think this is applicable to folks who work up here in tech. And they've got this famous opening, right, where that includes a bunch of logos from different companies, kind of rising and falling and stuff. And people say that there's this old Chinese proverb, I don't know if that's even true, I think it's apocryphal, of like, may you live in interesting times. The thing I tell other CISOs when I run into them is, may you have a long enough career as a CISO that one of the more difficult moments of your professional career becomes a visual gag on an HBO show. That can be kind of your legacy, that's what put on your tombstone in your obituary is something that people were joking about on HBO. But I think while Silicon Valley is kind of a funny show and pokes fun with love, it does demonstrate that there's an incredibly deep distrust of tech, an incredibly deep distrust of the things of those who are building tech. I think it's partially because we have some real fundamental problems in tech in general, but also specifically in information security. And one of those fundamental problems that we still have in security is that those of us in security are super in love with complexity. We are fascinated by the really interesting problems and the incredibly complex Rube Goldberg solutions that we could put in place to fix those problems. So I'm kind of a fake professor now, and I've been told to be a real academic, you have to have something named after yourself, right? And you also have to write a book and assign it to your students, that they have to pay $75 for it to get the credit. So I'm starting with step one, which is trying to name something. And there's something I actually started using as a tool in 2017 when I gave a talk at Black Hat, but I've been refining it and trying to keep up to date. And I need your help to make this stick. The Stamos hierarchy of actual bad stuff that happens to real people. So it kind of rolls off the tongue. It's a real simple thing. I want you to just to drop it in any conversation that you're having. But what I think we need to start to do is we got to start to aim against complexity and the really sexy work, and we have to start thinking about every day when we go to work for the hour of for those hours of time that we're spending in the office, probably in a horrible, crappy, open plan office where everybody has to have noise-canceling headphones, and we're spending it doing that instead of walking through the forest or spending time with our children or meditating, that for every hour we are sitting in front of a screen doing this work, that we should get the most ROI out of the time that we are giving to reduce the harm to other people, right? That is what we should optimize for. And it turns out, if I kind of look backwards at my career, I've probably misspent most of it and not being focused on things that cause the actual amounts of harm. And this became really clear to me over the last couple of years when I was in a CISO role for companies that serve hundreds of millions to billions of people, is it turns out the the vast majority of bad things that happen to people online have nothing to do with traditional information security. They are what we classify abuse. And abuse is the technically correct use of the products we build to cause harm. So this is all of hate speech and harassment and disinformation. This is the sexual abuse of children. This is the spreading of lies to abuse people. This is a type of abuse called sextortion, the extortion to try to get nude photos from both adults and kids. There's a whole host of really horrible things that happen with the technologies we build every single day that have no interesting technical component, right? These are the technically correct use of these products, but with the goal of harming people. And the vast majority of bad stuff, of the bad things that happen to people today because of the things we build, the majority of that will be abuse. And this is for a number of reasons, but partially because all of these problems have existed in society for a long period of time. Yet the internet especially can make them easier to do, easier to amplify. It can give people at least the feeling, if not the actual pseudo-anonymity they need to pull it off without getting arrested. And so none of these things are new, but they've all been adapted and made a much bigger problem due to this work. And then we have kind of at the top, traditional InfoSec, the stuff that we've all been doing, of the trying to prevent people from technically manipulating systems to violate privacy, confidentiality, and the integrity of data, the availability of systems, right? Now, if you zoom into the InfoSec pyramid, right? So let's zoom into this and make it the whole thing. You'll find that even if you reduce yourself to only caring about information security, which, despite the last slide, InfoSec is still really important, right? It's really important for us to build secure systems. But if you think about the things that actually harm people every day, what you'll figure out is that the basic things that cause the most harm are the most prosaic. The number one source of people's information being stolen online, the absolute number one, with a bullet, nothing even close, is the reuse of passwords across the internet. The number one risk to customers of Microsoft, especially Office 365, is not the Ministry of State Security of the People's Republic of China coming after you guys with a brand new kernel exploit that nobody's ever seen before. It's the fact that every real estate agent and title company in the United States uses an Office 365 account, has not turned on two-factor, and every day millions of dollars are stolen from innocent people of their down payments on their houses because their title company didn't use two-factor, and their wire transfer was redirected to a bank first in Cyprus and then moved to somewhere in Eastern Europe. That is probably the worst thing that will happen on Microsoft's products today from the number of people who are being hurt, right? And it's because it's a simple attack. It requires exploiting people who are not that technically sophisticated. It has a history in like a very basic part of the American economy where we do really silly things like send people's life savings and wire transfers that aren't authenticated. And so there's a bunch of different factors, but the core problem is just the account lifecycle problem and the password problem. When we start to talk about actually exploiting systems, the vast majority of those problems are patching, right? Everybody knows what's your guys' favorite MS number from the last couple of years? What's your favorite, Eric? Does it perhaps end with a 10? Yes, right? So the most important exploit against Microsoft systems for the last couple of years has been the Eternal Blue exploit, right? This beautiful, highly stable exploit with fantastic anti-exploit mitigations and offsets. Beautiful, paid for by the American taxpayer, so we should all pat ourselves on the back for paying all this money for this gorgeous exploit that was then leaked by the shadow brokers. But for the vast majority of damage caused by the Eternal Blue exploit, especially in the form of WannaCry, not Petya, all of that damage would have been preventable if people had patched their systems. For the vast majority of time that Eternal Blue was being used outside of the NSA, patches were available, right? And it's the fact that patching is really hard that you end up with the National Health Service of the United Kingdom going down, that you end up with the Maersk shipping line almost going out of business, only being saved by the fact that there was a power outage in one of their African ports, and so they still had a domain controller that they could recover. Patching is the source of the vast majority of actual exploits that we deal with. Simple configures of people configuring their systems in basic ways, standard old web app vulns, we see this all the time. Seeing like the Equifax hack was a standard off-the-shelf issue. And then at the top, you basically have all of new security research, right? So this is like everything that people are writing papers about and talking about at Black Hat and DEF CON and RSA and such. And then the top pixel of this is O-Day, right? So all of true O-Day fits into the top pixel of this triangle, which again is a zoom in of the actual triangle of human abuse. And all my time as a CISO, I think I only saw, and I was a CISO of companies that play at the top level that have the best adversaries, I think I only saw true O-Day deployed twice in that period of time. Even the most advanced attackers, the MSSs, the PLAs, the SVRs, these organizations will use off-the-shelf exploits and off-the-shelf tools 99 times out of 100 if they can get away with it. They don't want to burn their O-Day. They don't want to do anything that's more complicated or harder they have to do. Now, if you had Superman vision and you were able to zoom in to this screen, you would see that every pixel on the screen is actually comprised of subpixels, right? Of red, green, and blue subpixels. This subpixel represents all of the human harm ever caused by side channel attacks in the history of information security. This is what dominates discussion in the security research community, is super complicated esoteric issues for which there's almost no demonstration ever, or even good theoretical purposes in which this would be the best way for somebody to leak out information or somehow otherwise compromise the system, right? And so this is the fundamental problem, is that if you actually look at what people are working on, that pyramid is inverted. People are spending way more than a subpixel thinking about super esoteric side channel attacks in Intel processors, for examples, right? That doesn't mean we shouldn't research it, it doesn't mean we shouldn't fix it, but it shouldn't be the thing that we think way more about. I want to read way more about how people are making it easier for real enterprises to patch their systems. I want to read way more about how people are designing their systems to not be able to be easily abused, to cause harm in a variety of really horrible ways, than I read about more side channel attacks. I certainly don't want people coming up with damn names and domains just for their side channel attack. That drives me totally insane, right? And the fact that we reward that behavior over and over again as an industry only makes things worse. Another fundamental issue that we're all dealing with in tech is we're lacking a real good model for the relationship between these incredibly powerful tech companies, individuals, and the government. Now, who is responsible for keeping people safe and who's responsible for making decisions on behalf of other people is the history of all of politics, right? This is what every war has been fought about. This is what every kind of philosophical discussion's about, is who's in charge and how do you make decisions. And so we have a long history of arguing over these things and a number of ways of dealing with those arguments, either in a violent or non-violent manner. But what has happened in the last couple of years is we've seen a whole new revolution in information that has overturned hundreds and hundreds of years of these philosophical arguments. So for most of the history of the human race, which is something like 500,000 to 1 million years, depending on when you cut off Homo sapiens. My brother is actually a real anthropologist, and so it's an interesting discussion of like how old is humanity turns into a 90-minute lecture. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna say 500,000 years. Thanks. So for most of the history of the human race, the only people that you could communicate with are people who could physically hear your voice, right? So the number of people you could speak to are the people who could hear you. And then we had the invention of writing in the written word, which was limited to a very small number of literate people. And for the most part, for much of history, especially in the Western world, that written word was controlled by a small number of organizations who had people who could go copy the words over and over again. In particular, the Christian church, which eventually became the Catholic and Orthodox churches, controlled the history of the Western world because they decided what is and is not valuable enough for people to sit there and manually copy. Then we have the invention of movable type, and it's being brought to the West. And movable type made it so at least rich people could speak to hundreds or thousands of people. And the result of the printing press was hundreds of years of war in Europe. Hundreds of years of people killing one another because of the ability for people to spread those ideas. But we kind of figured out how to stop killing each other because of that. And then we had radio and television. And radio and television were once again actually really unifying. Now you can speak to millions of people with the radio, but it cost a lot of money to do so, and because of things like spectrum being required, you had lots of legal regulation. So for most of the 20th century, we have a huge consolidation of speech. And the internet has massively blown that apart. And it's created a situation where for the first time ever, a normal person without a lot of money, without a corporation, can speak to millions of people, but can do so in a way where those gatekeepers that naturally existed in the print world and in in the radio and television world no longer exist. And that is what our society is really fundamentally dealing with. And so hundreds of years of arguments that, like, for example, arguing about the First Amendment, a lot of those arguments are based upon the idea of the printed word being what they're arguing about, right? And these are not new problems. The United States was partially founded by people who used anonymous political speech to start a revolution, right? And so anonymous political speech causing trouble, not exactly a new thing, but certainly is a different thing when it's something that's available in the hands of everybody. And so all of these decisions that we've argued about for hundreds of years have been reopened, and we're arguing about them in a way that's much more quick and without kind of the framework that we used to rely upon that we thought was really fundamental here. And part of the problem is that people don't really know what trade-offs they want. So like the classic optimization problem in all of engineering is this one, right? That you can have something built quickly, you can have it built correctly or cheaply, right? Pick two of these three things. Pick some point in this triangle to optimize for your engineering project. I once gave a talk to a bunch of Air Force generals, and they pointed out if you want to get none of these things, you should use the Pentagon procurement process. So it's not necessary that you're actually in the triangle. There are other things outside of it, I guess, that are Pentagon-shaped. But for most engineering projects, this is what you're choosing, right? Well, it turns out when we talk about the optimization problems in the modern world, especially around people's speech online, this optimization problem is much more complicated. And there's a bunch of equities that are really valid equities that all of us could agree are good equities that you can't get all at the same time. And in fact, unlike the triangle, the relationship between these equities is much more complicated. It's much harder to predict that when you move towards one of these equities, which ones do you move away from, sometimes in a nonlinear manner. So some great examples of this would be the idea of data portability and competition versus data protection. GDPR, the big European law, both requires tech companies to allow people's data to be portable, but then also gives them the responsibility to keep that data from going somewhere else. And so there's a fundamental tension of if you allow people to take all of their data, especially on a communications platform, they will also be taking other people's data, right? If I export my Gmail inbox, I'm exporting the communications and the metadata about thousands of people with whom I've communicated. Is that my right to have portability? Does that override the right of those people to control whether or not I take their data to another platform? The GDPR turns out not to actually deal with that problem. They just kind of punted it onto the tech companies. And so you end up with those kinds of problems where politicians want both things, kind of like a child, and don't make a decision of how do they want to have a balancing act between these equities. Another really big one is the power of corporations to control speech. The most common complaint that kind of I heard at Facebook was, Facebook is way too powerful, and I want that power used to squash my enemies, right? That was like the summary of a bunch of things. And you saw this a lot with Mark Zuckerberg on the Hill yesterday. That was effectively what a number of members of Congress within their 5 minutes would both be like, you're way too powerful, and I want that power used directly compatible with my personal political preferences, right? And it turns out that that's not how it works, right? That you have to decide who do we want making the decisions and what power do we want them to have? And then you have to kind of put up with the fact that if you give that power to somebody, they will make decisions that you personally disagree with. And this was kind of the idea of a lot of the constitutional structure of the United States, was the idea of, well, maybe there are things that we're just going to allow because we don't want people making those decisions, because we don't want humans, at least in the government, having that kind of power. But now that these decisions are being made by private corporations, we don't have a good model to decide what is and is not allowed, and what kind of process do we have to get to that point. Another really fundamental issue that the tech companies have done a really poor job with is that we are not proactively honest about the downsides of what we build. So in all of tech, kind of the standard, aesthetic is everything is wonderful, right? Like, if you watch a Apple keynote, Apple has taken this feeling of technology is a wonderful thing that makes people's lives better, and they have distilled it down to the pure crystalline cocaine essence of this idea that they are the absolute best, starting with Steve Jobs, but this has continued to be. the absolute best of putting out the idea that the things they build are wonderful and beautiful and perfect and make people's lives better and there's no possible downside to anything, right? And the rest of us have copied that aesthetic, have copied the idea that we only talk about the positive things, that we only talk about the ways that our products make people's lives better, that we try to avoid whenever possible talking about downsides. And the truth is when you build products for humans, products that are gonna fit into human society, you have to deal with the fact that human society is flawed and that humans are flawed, sometimes to an incredible extent. And one of the places in which we have the best statistics on this is on the sexual abuse of children. And that's because this area of abuse has a particular structure in which that there is a nonprofit organization that has been chartered by the United States Congress to be able to hold onto examples of child abuse and to coordinate between a bunch of companies and law enforcement and to publish statistics. And in 2018, this organization, the National Center on Missing and Exploited Children, received 18 million reports from tech companies of child abuse in the United States alone. So that's 18 million reports on a basis of 330 million people, right? The numbers globally are much larger, but we don't really have them because most countries don't have the same kind of organization. So this is the basic reality that we are building our technologies in, is a reality where this organization exists. This organization is actually quite old. This is for those of you old enough, these are the people who have like kind of milk carton kids, right? So NCMEC was really built for organizing the search for missing children and doing things like putting kids' pictures on milk cartons and on posters and on informing law enforcement to be on the lookout. But they have transitioned to being really focused about the online because that's where the abuse is transitioned. And NCMEC is part of a whole set of organizations that have been talking about these problems for a long period of time. And a lot of that discussion has shifted to the digital world. Kind of the centerpiece of a lot of discussion in the United States is this conference called the Crimes Against Children Conference, which is one of the most horrible things I've ever been at in my life. It's a set of wonderful people who are working really hard on something that is incredibly terrible. It's actually the only keynote I've ever cried in, which a number of my coworkers are like, Alex, that's great that you're so in touch with your emotions. I was like, I'm not trying to be in touch with my emotions. I'm just crying, right? Like, it is an incredibly hard thing to go to. And this is their real schedule. And this is a conference where the session on pediatric strangulation, a multidisciplinary response, is so popular that they have to do it twice because the room fills up, right? And so this is the reality that we are living in as technologists, but we don't recognize that, right? We don't engage with the fact that this is the reality of humanity, and that by definition, these things will be reflected on our platforms. And so because we don't talk about these problems, we don't set up the stage for an honest conversation with people about what we should do in response. And so that balancing act I talked about of picking all these equities on that big, whatever, star, that conversation is really distorted by the fact that we don't talk about the fact that we live in a world with lots of adversarial groups from both a security and abuse perspective who are very good at what they do, and that we in tech are not perfect, and that we will build products that will reflect that, and that trying to fix it is an ongoing thing. And there are people who are definitely engaged. All those companies at the bottom left are companies that get together at a side conference during the Crimes Against Children to talk about child safety. And so there's definitely engagement on it, but you'll never ever hear them talk about it, which is becoming a real problem. And in fact, in the last couple of weeks, somebody leaked the fact that out of the 18 million reports to NCMEC, about 14 million of them came from Facebook alone, which, because Facebook doesn't talk about this, was then interpreted by the press to say Facebook's the worst company. Now, it actually turns out it's the opposite, that the company that reports the most is the company that's doing the most, right? So a certain competitor of yours that makes cell phones only made 150 reports. And so if you're looking at a company that sells devices for billions of people and only 150 of them have ever done anything abusive to children, they're not that nice people, right? That's just statistically, that just means that they're not looking, right? But this is a problem of Facebook's making because Facebook has not spent the time to say, we have this huge team, we're doing all this ML, we're doing all this work, we're coordinating with Microsoft with PhotoDNA, we're building our own algorithms. That discussion has never happened, and so when one statistic leaks out into the press, it becomes this whole brouhaha where then people come out of it, and we heard this from a number of members of Congress yesterday, of like, why is Facebook so bad on child safety? And Zuckerberg had to, the time you want to explain this is not on C-SPAN, right? Trust me, as somebody who's been on C-SPAN, that's supposed to be the performative part. It's not supposed to be the actual educational component. And so the fact that the companies have missed the opportunity to educate in a much more calm and realistic setting is a real problem. And then another fundamental issue on the kind of both the abuse and the InfoSec side is we're not learning from our mistakes, right? That as an industry, bad things happen, and then we don't fix the fundamental problems that led to it. Anybody in here speak Russian? Any Russian speakers? Couple? Sir, do you mind reading that for us out loud so people can, I can't say it with a correct accent. It's the Federal Security Service. How do you say it in Russian, by the way? That's beautiful, thank you, yes. The Federal Security Service, also known as the FSB. So the Federal Security Service, the FSB, is one of the two descendant organizations out of the KGB, the other one being the SVR. The third organization you've heard a lot about is the GRU, which is the military intelligence, main intelligence directorate. That's a completely separate organization. The FSB is really focused on domestic security, as well as spying on people within what Russia considers its near abroad, which are mostly ex-Soviet states, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine, and the like. The FSB once caught a young Latvian man named Alexei. And Alexei was doing some hacking, and he wasn't supposed to be doing that. And the FSB colonel, according to what I've been told by some FBI agents, gave Alexei a choice. Alexei could either spend the rest of his life in a dank, dark cell in the basement of a horrible building, or he could work for them. And so Alexei chose option B, right? That he decided that he was going to do work on behalf of the FSB. And so Alexei has a whole set of hackers that work for him who are globally distributed. A number of them are in Russia, but they actually turn out to be all over the world. And they both do hacking on their behalf, but then every once in a while, do hacking on behalf of the Russian government. And my path crosses with Alexei's in that he was the guy who led the team who broke into Yahoo a couple of months after I took over as CISO there. And I spent most of my time at Yahoo trying to get Alexei and his friends out of our network. And so that was a big fight for us. There were a lot of problems at Yahoo that made it really difficult for us to go up against a professional team like this. And it ended up real poorly for the company, and we'll talk about some of the fundamental issues there. But like lots of companies, we had a fight, we eventually prevailed, and then what comes after the beating of the actual intruders is the company takes on another fight, and that fight is against class action lawyers. And so I don't have to explain to you guys who this man is. I sometimes do have to explain to undergrads, amazingly enough. It's like, he's not just the malaria guy, but he used to do computer stuff. But you guys know what these videos is from, right? Anybody want to throw it out? Yeah, this is for his deposition. So a deposition is when you give testimony for a trial, but not in court, right? This is how a lot of civil cases, while the movies like to show that everybody's always in court, that's not how civil cases work. In civil cases, what happens is the witness shows up in a conference room in a law firm, and a bunch of lawyers ask questions, and there's a bunch of lawyers from that person's side and from the company, and they videotape it, and there's a little stenographer sitting there and typing, right? And so I had to go do this multiple times, I think 4 times for Yahoo, right? Because whenever you have a security breach, you end up with these lawyers, some of them actually have automated systems that will file lawsuits as quickly as possible so that they can be first in line to get class action. And so you have a state class action, you have a federal class action, you have a class action on behalf of shareholders, on behalf of users, and there's this big, huge argument about who gets to be the lawyers in charge, and they all work it out through some really arcane rules. But then eventually there's actually some subsequent lawsuits, and so I had to spend a bunch of time getting questioned, and that's fine. Like, I took the CISO job at Yahoo knowing it was going to be a hard job, knowing that I was taking on a huge amount of responsibility, and that I was going to be responsible for my actions. And so the fact that I spent something like 30 or so hours being questioned about all the things that led into the breach was fine with me. And then they talked to dozens of other people. They talked to the CEO. They talked to a bunch of people from technology, a bunch of people on my team. They collected tens of thousands of emails and documents. They did thousands and thousands of hours of investigation into what went wrong at Yahoo. Thousands and thousands of hours. And what do you guys think the output of that was? Of the thousands and thousands of hours of work, of all of these executives in question, of the creation of thousands of pages of testimony. The output of all of this was a couple of lawyers from Florida got $35 million, right? This is what our society did with the retroactive look at what happened at Yahoo, is we decided to give the people who were the fastest and the best at fighting that they get to represent the class action $35 million, and then another $50 million being spread around all the users, right? And then all of that documentation got buried, right? In fact, I'm not even allowed, while I have copies of a bunch of documents, they're under a protective order. And so the way this works is because of the settlement, the company gets to lock up whatever Yahoo is now. It turns out the question of who is Yahoo now after their acquisition, it turns out to be this interesting question. But like whatever corporate entity represents Yahoo's interests was able to lock up all of these documents and stuff so that none of the people who were involved could talk about it, right? They paid $85 million and then all of that work goes away. And this is why we keep on making the same mistakes over and over again, is that every time there's a problem, we don't talk about it publicly, we just bury it. And maybe there's a lawsuit and maybe some people make some money, but certainly people don't come out and proactively say, this is how we screwed up and this is how you should fix it. This is the same problem at 3 major companies, right? GitHub, one of your guys' companies, Twitter, and Facebook. And this problem with unencrypted passwords didn't exist because these companies don't know you're supposed to encrypt passwords. The problem was that, well, what do you guys think? What was the root cause here? What did a developer do? What did like one developer probably do that caused these problems? They turned on parameter logging on post requests, right? Yes, in all of these cases, some developer turned on parameter logging, they logged it probably to some huge internal data warehouse where nobody knows what's in it, and they left that data warehouse going. And so just like if you left a hose going long enough in your lawn, you'll end up flooding the lawn, they ended up flooding their company with unencrypted passwords, right? But none of these companies came out and did a deep retrospective because there was no motivation for them to do so. Because if they came out and said, this is how we screwed up, they get made fun of in the press, they get sued, all these bad things happen. This is different than other industries, and probably the industry that has the best example of doing really technically hard things and doing so safely all the time is the aviation industry, right? If the aviation industry was as bad as we are, we'd all be dead, right? Like, there's no way. The odds of me surviving my flight up here to Seattle last night would have been really poor if the aviation industry did safety like we do safety in the technology industry. And there's some reasons for this. There's obviously cultural reasons or structural reasons, but also there are a bunch of structures around when bad things happen, people learn from them. So if there's a major incident where like people die or there's a whole loss or injuries, then there's a real investigation run by the government that everybody participates in, right? And that's the National Transportation Safety Board, and they have professional investigators who understand aviation, who go to wherever the bad thing happened, interview all of the people involved, deeply dive into the forensic evidence, and then something around a year or so afterwards, publish a huge document of this are all the things that went wrong. And they don't just say like, this fan blade cracked. They say the fan blade cracked, which is because of this manufacturing defect, and that was related, and it wasn't caught because of this, and wasn't caught because of that, and this is the reason why the FAA didn't have good enough oversight. And so they come up with all of the root causes that got you there. We don't do this in cyber, right? There's nobody, the Equifax breach, nobody's going and diving into what happened. We're never going to see a 200-page report of these are the fundamental problems inside of Equifax that you can learn from. And because NTSB does this, the rest of the industry learns that every time something bad happens, it hopefully only happens once or twice before everybody else learns from it and then they make a different mistake. Whereas in tech, we just make the same mistakes over and over again for different companies. There's also a part of this that's really interesting, which is there's a whole system that is built to encourage people to report near misses, right? So the ASRS system is a system that's run by NASA, and if you're involved in the aviation industry, you get legal protection that if you say, man, I really screwed up, something bad happened, you can give that information to ASRS, and that can't be used to pull your license or to sue you or to do anything like that. And so if you're a nervous flyer, I do not recommend looking at this database, because it is the database of every possible thing that might have happened that almost killed people. But like in this example, here's a real example of a plane getting, almost crashing on landing at SFO because of an autopilot error that turned into a human error, but they figured it out and they fixed it before they landed. And so when this pilot went through this problem, their reaction was probably to go back to the hotel, have a scotch, and then to sit down and to write all their recollections down and to submit it. And now other people can go look at all of these recollections of all these people who've went through it, and they can come up with lessons for all of us. And we don't have anything like that in InfoSec. And as you guys know, there's a lot of near misses, right? For every breach you hear about, there's a dozen situations where somebody tried and the defenders got lucky, right? That maybe they broke into the wrong system, or your detection systems ended up catching them right at the last second. There's a dozen of those near misses, and we don't learn about any of those because they all get covered up immediately. So what are the lessons actually from Yahoo versus the FSB? So 3 ones that hopefully are helpful to you. First is, if you're not moving forward, you're drowning. So one of the core problems at Yahoo was Yahoo had to invent web-scale architectures in the late 90s, right? So like before Yahoo did it, nobody really handled 1 million concurrent users on a web page. That was crazy. And so this core technical team invented all the stuff that we see as standard now of like NoSQL databases, distributed databases, equivalents of memcache, a bunch of different systems to manage hundreds of thousands of Unix systems at the same time, which was totally ridiculous in the late 90s. They built all that stuff. But the problem is it stayed all that stuff, so the rest of the world moved on, and then Yahoo stayed the same. And so as a result, by the time I got there, Yahoo was hiring all these young engineers to effectively reverse engineer the stuff that was built by people that now had gray ponytails to figure out, like, oh my God, how does this database of user data work? And they would basically have to pray to the system that had been built up like the layers of Troy, of code built on the burned layers that came before it, that nobody knew how it worked. Well, it turned out Alexei and his friends figured out how it worked. But if you're not moving forward, if you're not reinventing yourself, you end up getting stuck, and that becomes a real problem in technology, that if you can't build something and just leave it there for 10 years and think it's still going to be secure, the world moves on, so you have to, the basic systems have to move on as well. The second is that tech companies can be too responsive to Wall Street. And so one of the core problems at Yahoo was it was extremely responsive to investor pressure. When I started there was a lot of focus on security, and then we ended up picking up a activist investor. It turns out this activist investor, their big claim to fame was they took over the Olive Garden. So it's like, oh, well, that makes them totally able to help run a company that serves like 500 million people's email, right? Because they figured out the breadstick problem at the Olive Garden. And so as a result, because of this activist investor, there was a huge focus to make money in the short term and for user growth in the short term, because the company just cared about the numbers for the quarter. Because 1 or 2 bad quarters meant the entire management team and the board was going to be replaced. And so because Yahoo was so responsive to Wall Street and cared so much about short-term profits, that ended up pulling away resources from the really important things. In fact, I think the way we compensate people in tech is really wrong. From my perspective, we should no longer give RSUs to public tech company employees. Like, if you're at a private company, it's great for you to have stock so you're aligned with the founders and the investors, but at a Facebook or Google or Microsoft, stock is just cash. And it's cash that is priced by Wall Street. And so you have the situation where CEOs can say something like, we're gonna do the right thing, we're gonna focus on safety and trust. And by the way, 80% of your compensation, executives, is based upon whether Wall Street likes our quarterly numbers. But don't listen to them who are paying for your house. Listen to me, the CEO, who's just saying something. Right? And so that's what we find ourselves in, is this huge mismatch between what our executives say and how we're compensated, and we really should not care about what hedge funds think about what we're doing. We should feel good about what we're doing ourselves, is what I think. And then the third kind of personal lesson is if you ever have an IV in your arm, you should turn your phone off. In the deposition, one of the things they do is they have all these emails, and they make you read the emails. I'm at this big table, and there's like 3 or 4 lawyers on the plaintiff's side, and there's like 7 or 8 lawyers. 2 of them are mine, a bunch of them are Yahoo, a bunch of them are other companies that might be Yahoo. Again, it's really complicated, like who's Yahoo in this situation. But there's like a zillion lawyers, there's a video camera, there's a stenographer. Everybody in the room is getting paid to be there but me, right? And they're all watching every single thing I say. And they push across this binder, and they say, Mr. Stamos, can you please turn to tab 53. And I turn to tab 53 and I'm like, oh shit. And like, Mr. Stamos, can you read, do you know what this email is? Oh, this looks like an email I sent to my boss on this date, yada yada. Mr. Stamos, could you read this email, please? Really? Do I? Yes, you need to read it, please. Okay. Dear Jay, Why the F am I? No, Mr. Stamos, you need to say the whole words. You can't say why the M, F, and MF. And so I read this email of why the F, and I'm saying the F for you, but I'm now saying it for real in front of the stenographer who has to record everything. Why the F am I getting this email from these MFing consultants who want to effing lay off my people in the middle of an effing breach? I'm like, can I stop? No, you need to read the whole email. And so I read this whole email that's like this. And it's because while we were dealing with the Russian breach at Yahoo, I actually messed up my knee. It was my third knee surgery. My first two were because of like soccer injuries in high school, which turns out that like the high school girls are like, oh man, you're a hero. It turns out when you break your knee putting up Christmas decorations, your wife does not treat you like that anymore. Your wife's response is a little more muted. And so, thanks to Christmas decorations, I was on crutches, and I wouldn't do the surgery because we're in the middle of incident response, and I need to be running the team. And my doctor's like, okay, well, if you don't fix it, you're just going to limp forever. But go ahead and do your whatever hacky thing that you're doing. And so we're doing it, and then finally, we have a good weekend. We think the bad guys are out of the network, and so I schedule the surgery. And so I'm sitting there in the surgery center with an IV in, and I check my phone, and I have an email from my boss saying that these consultants from the outside, in response to all these Wall Street demands, had come up with a list of my employees who are going to be laid off. And it's like the embers are still smoldering from our breach, and these are the people who are putting out the embers, and they wanted to lay them off. And so my response was very candid, I guess you would say. And so my advice to you personally is if you find yourself in that situation, turn off the phone, put it down, and respond after surgery, because somebody might make you read that email out loud on videotape and in front of a judge if they read the transcript. Anyway, just a little tip. And then we have another fundamental thing that we continue to do in tech, which is when we scale the culture of our companies, we end up worshiping the past. There's a great blog called Stratechery. This guy, Ben Thompson, wrote this really good piece about the importance of culture in companies. And what he says is that culture exists because in a company, when you show up to work in that horrible open office plan, like you don't go and talk to the CEO and say, hey, CEO, what am I doing today, right? The corporate culture is what informs you to make all of those little decisions consistent with what the corporation might want. And so culture is super important. And it's super important in companies that are really successful. But the problem is that companies will get successful and then people will look back at that culture and they'll be like, oh, all of the aspects of our culture 5 years ago were critical to our success. And that's not true. Some of them are critical. Some of them are no longer reasonable based upon what's happened in the world. And this was a core problem at Facebook, is that cultural touchstones that were super important for the growth of the company were totally fine when the company was effectively a life support system for Farmville, right? But when the company became the most important news distribution platform in the planet, then those cultural touchstones no longer worked. And this is just like, especially for those of you at startups, you have to be really careful about making sure as the company grows that you don't venerate the past too much, and that you don't let people who were part of the decisions that were made that were important, who are often now really rich and really powerful, you can't overemphasize their opinion versus the people who come in. Because that's a core problem that you see in a lot of companies. And Google's probably a great example of that. Google is one of the most influential companies on Silicon Valley in tech culture overall. And they gave us this idea of basically the diva that has to be protected, like the 10 times engineer that whatever they do, however they treat their coworkers, you protect them. That is one of the most damaging and horrible ideas that have ever made it out. This is exactly the kind of thing that if somebody is an incredible engineer but they're a jerk, we need to treat them as a jerk, right? And you need to have a corporate culture where people treat each other well. And so you gotta push against this. Okay. So I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go kind of quickly, but what are some of the things that we can be doing other than the things we've been talking about? The first is the key to predicting harm against individuals is to have empathy for your users. And the key to empathy is team diversity. So take 5 seconds and look around at the people who are sitting around you. Just go ahead. I want to see heads swiveling. Yes. So how many people named John do you think? Like, raise your hand if your name's John. Let me see all the Johns. Yeah, right. Are there more Johns than women in the room? Are there more Erics than women in the room, right? This room is not reflective of the Americans that use our products. It is definitely not reflective of the 3 to 4 billion people around the world who use the products we build, right? And this doesn't mean we're bad people for being part of the industry, but we have to build our teams to be reflective of those who can be harmed by our actions so that we have the ability to predict the things that can go wrong and to build solutions that work for them. We need to shift risk ownership in organizations to the people who make the real decisions. So one of the real problems with being a CISO in 2019 is that you effectively have the same responsibilities of a post-Sarbox chief financial officer without the tool of accounting, right? In that a CFO is not the only person who cares about not doing illegal things inside of a company. You're not allowed to be the SVP of a publicly traded company and to say, hey, boss, CEO, I just made $10 billion in profit. I want a huge bonus. By the way, it's all Enron accounting. But we'll just fire the CFO and we'll be good, right? That is effectively how we do security in most public companies, is that we have the security team be the owners of the risk and the owners of the critical decisions, when what they really should be are the consultants, the people who are helping out, the shoulder to cry on, and the people who measure risk and take it to the board. And so we have to push these decisions into the people who make the real decisions that matter in these companies. In the security industry, we have to adjust our incentives towards harm instead of complexity. So when we want to see research, we should see research that really matters. This is one of my favorite papers from the last couple of years. The privacy and security threat models and mitigation strategies of older adults. This is effectively, this paper represents all of your Thanksgiving breaks, which is spent getting the malware off of the bad Chrome plugins off of all of your dads and uncles and computers, right? And you're like, I'm not gonna ask my dad where he got this malware. Oh, please God, I'm not looking at his browser history. I'm just gonna fix this computer, right? This is a study of how people actually get harmed, and especially older folks. And I think that kind of work is we should see. I want to see 20 of these for every side channel attack that gets its own domain, okay? That's what we have to do as an industry. We've got to teach these lessons in the classroom. So this was some really interesting research about a dating app that is aimed at the LGBTQ community, and it made the same mistake that lots of dating apps make, which is you're trying to provide somebody a distance to somebody else that they're looking at, but you don't want let them figure out exactly where that person is. So the easiest way to do this is to grab the fine GPS data, send it up to the cloud, and then add random numbers. What's the problem with just adding random numbers? They average out, right? And so if you grab over and over again, you can just average it all out and then you recreate the person's fine GPS data. In this case, this could have caused real harm based upon who this product was targeted at. And everybody's made this mistake. Tinder, Grindr, a gazillion apps have made this mistake and fixed it, but we never teach those things back in school. And so you can graduate from almost every university and not know anything about this problem. We're working on this at Stanford, so this is a class that we're putting together that I'm teaching 10 students right now, and we're hoping about 100 students in the next quarter about the real things that happen online. And then our goal is to get lots of people to teach it, so we're going to open source it. So anyway, my overall message is we won, right? Like, we're the cool kids now. The nerds inherited the earth. Wow, yeah, yay for us. Developers, right? Like, we won. We got to do better, right? Like, we told people they need to pay attention to us. They need to care about the things we're doing. We have to actually live up to when we say we're going to change the world, we have to believe that we change the world, and we have to act accordingly. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. I'll be over under the Blue Dragon if anybody wants to chat. Thanks for having me.